By 1982, the whole world had its eyes on several regions that were going through a great number of military and diplomatic conflicts. This was not the case for the South Atlantic region, whose waters were as calm and cold as usual. However, in April 1982, the peace of those waters was suddenly interrupted, which would soon escalate into a conflict of global diplomatic and media proportions. Some inhospitable islands known as the Malvinas, or Falkland Islands, whose sovereignty was claimed by the Republic of Argentina. Their sovereignty was claimed by the Republic of Argentina on one side and by the United Kingdom on the other. They would soon become the stage for a new international conflict. It will forever resonate in the history books and in the collective memory of both nations. Thus, a whole series of disputes between Argentina and the United Kingdom over the possession of the islands led to the execution of the so-called Operation Rosario by the Argentine army, with the firm objective of reconquering the Malvinas and reincorporating them permanently into the nation. And what began as a strategic plan, carefully designed. In a matter of hours, it becomes a military action that will forever define the fate of the islands and of an entire region, that will change global geopolitics and spark a long debate that remains alive several decades later. However, it is worth asking, how did this operation come about? Who were the main players and what happened in those first hours that would change history forever? Join us today as we travel back to that early morning in April 1982 to answer all these questions and more. My name is Alejandro Andrade. This is La Nueva Enciclopedia. And before we start with today's story, I want to invite you to support our channel. Subscribe, like this video, share it with your friends, leave your opinions in the comment section, and don't miss any new episodes. And without further ado, let's get straight to today's topic. But before talking about the conflict sparked by Operation Rosario and the historical reasons behind the claims, both from Argentina and the United Kingdom, we need to go back a few centuries. The Malvinas Islands, or Falkland Islands, are an archipelago located in the South Atlantic Ocean, approximately 500 to 600 kilometers east of the Argentine Patagonian coast. The islands are mainly made up of two large islands, Soledad Island and Gran Malvinas Island, and several dozen smaller islands and islets. The dispute over the sovereignty of these islands begins with a debate over who arrived there first. It is believed that at the beginning of the 16th century, Spanish and Portuguese explorers may have sighted the islands. However, the first documented record of the islands is attributed to the English navigator John Davis in the year 1592. Thus, a few years later in 1690, the Briton John Strong landed on them and named them the Falling Islands. Despite this, the colonization of these islands did not come from England, but from France. In 1764, the French navigator Louis-Antoine de Bougainville founded the first colony at Puerto Soledad on Soledad Island. Shortly after the arrival of the French, Spain formally protested against them, claiming that the Malvinas were actually under its rule. According to the papal bull Inter Cetera, dating from the year 1493 and the treaties with Portugal from 1494, after these claims, France recognized the Spanish claim and transferred the settlement to the Spanish Empire in 1767. Spain, for its part, would maintain control of the islands until 1811, when the garrison stationed there was withdrawn due to the crisis faced by the Spanish Empire in America because of the independence revolutions. Thus, when Argentina declared its independence in 1816, it inherited the territories of the former Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, including the Malvinas Islands. In 1820, the Argentine government sent David Hewitt, an American privateer in the service of Buenos Aires, to the islands to reaffirm sovereignty. Hewitt's proclamation was heard by foreign ships, consolidating the Argentine presence in the area. Later, in 1829, Argentina created the political and military command of the Malvinas Islands, appointing Luis Bernet as governor. Bernet establishes a prosperous settlement with significant fishing and livestock activity. However, in 1831, after the indiscriminate hunting of seals by American ships was banned, an American frigate destroyed the Argentine facilities at Puerto Soledad. This event would be taken advantage of by the United Kingdom, which in 1833 sent the corvette HMS Clio to take control of the islands. The British expelled the Argentine garrison and consolidated their control, leaving behind a small population of settlers. From that moment on, Argentina began to consider this act as an illegitimate occupation and an affront to its sovereignty and international law. Over the years, and on the eve of the conflict, both countries have defended their claims with different arguments. Argentina, for its part, supports its claim over the Malvinas Islands with a series of historical, legal, and political arguments. To begin with, the Argentinians spoke of what they called territorial inheritance, since the Malvinas were part of the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. And when Argentina became independent from Spain, those lands became part of the new Argentine state. In addition to the historical territorial inheritance, it also points to its effective presence on the island, because from 1810 to 1833, Argentina had governors in the Malvinas Islands, established local laws, and promoted economic activities. In plain words, Argentina exercised real, direct, and concrete sovereignty over the territory until the islands were occupied by force. So for these reasons, the occupation of the islands by the United Kingdom was, for Argentina, a flagrant and clear violation of the principle of territorial integrity. On one hand, the British argue that before 1833, Argentina's presence on the islands was weak, and it did not exercise real control, nor did it have international recognition. In addition, they invoked the right of occupation and prescription as the legal basis for their sovereignty, rejecting the validity of the Argentine claim derived from Spanish colonial succession after independence. However, one of the most important British arguments had to do with the population of the islands. Since all of the islands, approximately 1,800 inhabitants in 1982, identified themselves as British or Kelpers, meaning descendants of the British settlers who began to populate the island after the occupation in 1833. On the other hand, the British argued that, since 1833, they had administered the territory without interruption, with a local government and a constant presence. And finally, the British emphasized the right to self-determination, arguing that according to the United Nations Charter of 1945, the islanders, who identified the United Kingdom as their nation, had the right to decide their political destiny, and that this should be respected. Thus, over time, the international community, pressured by both the United Kingdom and Argentina, had recognized that the conflict existed. Years later, on September 16, 1965, the UN approved Resolution 2065, which recognized that there was a sovereignty dispute over the Malvinas or Falkland Islands, and urged both parties to the dispute to negotiate. Thus, from the mid-1960s until the late 1970s, numerous diplomatic meetings were held between Argentina and the United Kingdom to try to resolve the conflict. However, none of these negotiations had any effect, as both countries stubbornly claimed that the islands were theirs. Following this sequence of events, these arguments, both from Argentina and the United Kingdom, reached a boiling point in 1982, which was also a crucial year for the politics of both countries. For its part, the United Kingdom was governed by the Conservative Party's Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, nicknamed the Iron Lady, and we have a video about her that we invite you to watch on our channel. Thatcher, at the head of a nation that throughout history had used its military strength to subdue entire countries. She was going through a period of low popularity with the public due to social conflicts caused by her economic policies, which generates great discontent among broad sectors of the population, especially among labor unions. Thus, Thatcher was waiting for some event that would allow her to overcome that disapproval and continue with her economic reforms. On the other hand, Argentina was also going through tense times. Since the 1976 coup d'etat, Argentina had been governed by a military junta that was presided over by several members of the army, like Jorge Rafael Videla, about whom we also have a video on our channel, who started the so-called national reorganization process. However, by 1982, the junta was presided over by Lieutenant General Leopoldo Galtieri, who in turn was the de facto president of the country. Galtieri, at the head of the Argentine government, was also facing that year a deep economic, social, and political legitimacy crisis with growing public discontent. In this sense, in an attempt to unify society and regain its support, Galtieri and the military government began to see the recovery of the Malvinas as a possible nationalist cause that would awaken pride and contribute to improving the public image of the regime. However, in the same way, the recovery of the Falkland Islands was an old and genuine desire of the entire Argentine army, especially of Jorge Anaya, commander of the Argentine Navy. Anaya, who had been a classmate of Galtieri, offered him his full support and that of the Argentine Navy, in exchange for a share of power and for seriously putting the issue of the Malvinas on the table. Even before Galtieri took office as president, Anaya had already ordered his subordinates to assess the feasibility of a military operation to recover the Falkland Islands. In 1981, he had ordered Juan José Lombardo, the commander of naval operations, to assemble a task force to determine the viability of the operation. So by December 1981, when Galtieri became president and the members of the military junta were renewed, Galtieri himself remained as commander of the army, Anaya from the Navy, and Basilio Lamy II from the Air Force. The plan to recover the Malvinas Islands begins to be set in motion. The original idea was a non-violent takeover of the occupied Argentine territories, and there were two possible scenarios, both of which would later prove to be completely wrong. The first scenario was that the United Kingdom would not fight for the islands, since, as we said, that country was facing a severe economic crisis, so it was considered very unlikely, or at least that's what the members of the junta thought, that the United Kingdom was unlikely to fight to keep territories like the Malvinas Islands, located more than 13,000 kilometers from London and inhabited by fewer than 1,500 people at that time. Such was the state of the British economy. Years earlier, in 1980, Nicholas Ridley, Minister of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, had proposed a solution known as leaseback, or leasing, in light of the expense involved in maintaining the Malvinas Islands. This proposal involved formally transferring the sovereignty of the islands to Argentina, while the United Kingdom would lease them for a set period of time to cover their administration. However, this idea was met with strong resistance, both from the islanders and from British parliamentarians, and ultimately the idea did not succeed. In addition to this, around this time, the United Kingdom had considered the possibility of withdrawing the HMS Endurance, the only British naval patrol ship in the South Atlantic, from its position. This was interpreted by the Argentine military junta as yet another sign of the supposed British lack of interest in defending the islands. Another mistaken scenario anticipated by the members of the junta was the supposed neutrality that the United States would have in the conflict. And they thought this because the Argentine military junta had been a strong ally of the United States in the fight against communism in the region. And this made them think that they indirectly had the approval of the United States. Furthermore, they believed that Washington was not interested in an armed conflict within the Western Bloc during the height of the Cold War. With these scenarios in mind, the planning team for the invasion of the Falkland Islands was expanded to include high-ranking members of the Army and the Air Force. The planning was carried out in the strictest secrecy. The military airline, Líneas Aéreas del Estado, known as LAD, regularly operates flights to the Falkland Islands. Vice Commodore Hector Giliberto, LAD's representative in Puerto Argentino, called Port Stanley by the British, had been gathering information for 4 years. The information gathered shows that the British garrison in the Falkland Islands was made up of approximately 68 British soldiers, 11 naval hydrographers, and 23 volunteers from the Falkland Islands Defense Force. In this regard, the task group concludes that a military operation to recover the islands is completely feasible. In the initial plans of the Argentine military government, one of the symbolic dates considered to launch what was now called Operation Rosario was July 9, 1982, Argentina's Independence Day. The date, however, seems a bit far off, so May 15 is set as a tentative date. However, an apparently unexpected event suddenly changes Argentina's plans. Although most of the conflict, as will be seen later, actually takes place. Besides the Falkland Islands, there were also other known islands, such as South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, controlled by the British and located 1,390 kilometers southeast of the Malvinas, which would also play a role in this story. On the eve of the conflict, the scrap metal company owned by the Argentine Constantino Davidoff secured a contract to dismantle old whaling facilities on the South Georgia Islands and charters the ship Bahia Buen Suceso from the Argentine Navy to transport its workers, who upon arriving on March 18 at Leith Harbor, located on those islands, raise an Argentine flag. Much has been speculated about this event. Many claim that the workers raised the flag spontaneously, surprising both the British and Argentine governments. Others assert that among the workers, there were members of the Argentine Navy who provoked the incident to further strain the already delicate situation. This event caused a major diplomatic crisis, prompting the United Kingdom's forces to become alert to the situation in the South Atlantic. Neither a strong military response nor the deployment of British ships and submarines put the military junta in a now or never situation. Finally, after this event, they decided to move up the operation. And so, on March 28, 1982, troops from the Argentine Army and Navy boarded ships and set course for the Falkland Islands, under the command of the operations leader, General Osvaldo Garcia. Their only objective is to land and recover once and for all the Falkland Islands. The Argentine fleet sails toward the islands with the intention of carrying out Operation Rosario on April 1st. However, due to adverse weather conditions, it is decided to postpone the landing to April 2nd. Thus, both Argentina and the United Kingdom found themselves on the brink of a major conflict that would forever shape the relationship between the two countries.
Yes.
Thus, on the night of April 1st, 1982, in complete darkness, the first groups of amphibious commandos and tactical divers prepared to carry out the mission. At 9:18 p.m., the silence on the high seas is broken when the first rubber boats detach from the destroyer, Ara Santísima Trinidad. Under the command of Lieutenant Commander Guillermo Sanchez Zavarotz, 84 elite men begin their advance toward the Malvinas coast. Minutes later, at 10:45 p.m., The main force of the amphibious commandos sets out in 19 inflatable boats, while the destroyer moves away to avoid being detected. The first Argentines set foot on solid ground at Mullet Creek, southeast of the Malvinas, at 11 p.m. But these are not the only men in action. Meanwhile, the submarine ARA Santa Fe, near the lighthouse at Cape San Felipe, releases 10 tactical divers whose mission is to place radio navigation beacons and secure the area for the later landing of troops and vehicles. Despite all the measures taken by the Argentine government, the military mobilization quickly raises suspicions of an invasion.
En ese mismo instante, en Londres, Margaret Thatcher se reúne con su gabinete de crisis.
And the U.S. President Ronald Reagan, a close ally of Thatcher, calls Galtieri from Washington to dissuade him from carrying out a military attack. But the decision had already been made. Back in the Falklands, the British coastal ship Forrest detects the movement of the submarine Santa Fe, alerting the British forces. At 11:40 p.m. on that same April 1st, in the area of the airport of Puerto Argentino, or Port Stanley, located in the northwest of the Falklands, a green flare briefly lights up the sky, and shortly after, the lights of the San Felipe lighthouse go out. The British were beginning to learn about the Argentine presence on the islands. The Argentine commandos, already on land, split into two main groups to carry out the next phase of the plan. At 1:30 a.m. on April 2nd, Sanchez Savarotz's unit splits again into two groups. The first group, led by Sanchez Savarotz himself, has the task of heading to Moody Brook, southwest of the Malvinas, where the British soldiers are stationed, with the goal of surprising and neutralizing them before they could organize a counteroffensive. The second group, led by Corvette Captain Pedro Edgardo Giacchino, heads toward the capital of the islands called Puerto Argentino, with the mission of taking the residence of the British governor Rex Hunt, capturing him, and thus securing administrative control of the Malvinas. The order from the Argentine High Military Command is not to cause casualties among the limited British forces defending the islands, let alone cause civilian casualties, because the Argentine government did not want to worsen the crisis with British casualties in order not to provoke an almost certain military response from London. Sanchez Savaroz's unit approached Moody Brook with extreme stealth. When they reached the barracks, the Argentines throw stun grenades and open fire on the British soldiers' barracks. However, they failed to achieve the planned surprise, since the British, alerted by unusual activity on the coast, had previously evacuated the barracks and were deployed in other defensive positions in the capital and at the governor's house. In Puerto Argentino, also known as Port Stanley, the commandos under the command of Giacchino are in the vicinity of Governor Hunt's house, close to capturing the target. The strategy was to take the building quickly and without causing unnecessary casualties, following the order to minimize violence. However, the British stationed there were ready, since the Argentinians' element of surprise had been lost, because of the noise caused by the explosions and gunfire that Sanchez Savarotz's front provoked in Moody Brook, which had been heard in the capital. The first armed confrontation between Argentinians and British was about to begin. The British soldiers had taken up defensive positions and were not willing to give up control without a fight. Thus, British fire abruptly breaks the silence, forcing the Argentinian commandos to temporarily fall back while they assess the situation. Giacchino, along with his men, launches an assault on the governor's house. The Argentinians try to force their way in, but they are met with intense fire from inside the building. Captain Giacchino advances on the front line, trying to gain ground, but in the exchange of gunfire, he is hit multiple times. Wounded, he falls to the ground, but he stays alive. The confrontation becomes difficult for the Argentine forces, who must strictly follow the order not to cause casualties. At that moment, and in that place, the Argentines were outnumbered by the defenders, since most of the Argentine commandos had been deployed toward the barracks in Moody Brook. Despite the strong British offensive, the Argentine commandos hold their position in the governor's house. The fighting goes on for hours until Sanchez Zavaros's force, which as we saw was in Moody Brook, reaches Puerto Argentino, or Port Stanley, after marching 8 kilometers to join the siege of the governor's house. Meanwhile, not far away on the beaches of the airport in the capital, Argentine troops begin to land, deployed from the ARA Cabo San Antonio. After the arrival of Sanchez Zavaros's men, the situation becomes untenable for the British. Governor Rex Hunt, aware that the island was surrounded, makes the decision to surrender. Immediately afterwards, when the ceasefire order arrives, the Argentine commandos secure the residence. During the siege of the governor's house, 3 Argentine soldiers are wounded, and Captain Giacchino, leader of the 2nd Assault Group, is rushed to the island hospital. But he does not survive, becoming the first casualty of the British-Argentine conflict in the Falklands. After the British surrender, the disembarked Argentine troops took to the streets of the capital. The images of the operation quickly spread around the world. The Argentine flag is raised and proudly waves once again in the Falklands. The photos of the British surrendering are a hard blow for the United Kingdom, but one photo in particular, the one of soldier Eliseo Batista, a member of the amphibious command, with the surrendered British soldiers lined up, stands out. According to many analysts, it becomes a symbol of humiliation for the British, a fact that will decisively influence London in favor of entering the war. However, the fighting was not over. The next day, in the early morning of April 3rd, 1982, the Argentine forces carried out a complementary operation on South Georgia, quickly taking control of the settlement of Great Viken and Leith Harbor. The British resistance in the area was made up of 22 British soldiers, led by Lieutenant Keith Mills, who had taken up positions at Punta Chalaya. After a brief confrontation in which only one of the defenders was wounded, the British Marines finally surrendered. In addition, another 13 men from the British Antarctic Survey Team, who had taken refuge in the church at Great Viken, surrendered without resistance. In this way, Operation Rosario, completed in less than 3 days, ends with the capture of the Falkland Islands and South Georgia by the Argentine army. They were immediately placed under its sovereignty and incorporated into the national territory. However, the operation was not without losses for the victorious Argentina, as the fighting left 3 Argentine soldiers dead, and a Puma helicopter was shot down in action. Even so, in Argentina, the news of their victory in the South Atlantic fills the population with joy and happiness. Meanwhile, soon after, international negotiations begin, along with condemnations and support from several governments around the world for Argentina. However, it remained to be seen what the response would be from the defeated and humiliated United Kingdom, which, sooner rather than later, would begin a series of military and diplomatic responses that would start one of the largest conflicts of its time, and which would be known in history as the Falklands War. You can find the full story of this fascinating episode on our channel. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end of the video. If you liked it, don't forget to give us a like, subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any new content from the channel, and share it with your friends through social networks like WhatsApp or Facebook. Remember that by doing this, you really help us reach new people. So thank you very much from the bottom of my heart to everyone for following and supporting us, and we'll see you next time.